Hi again, welcome back. My name is Tracy Vianera. I am an assistant research professor of philosophy here at the University of Connecticut. I was also a residential research fellow in 2017. I love Uchi, it's amazing. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the first session for today, and that's on intellectual humility, religion, and politics. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Krumrei Mancuso, and she will be speaking on the implications of socio-political intellectual humility and links to religiosity.
All right, so I'm going to start with a word of thanks to the John Templeton Foundation and to the Conviction and Humility Public Life Project, and especially also the leadership of Michael and Brendan with all of the work that's being done on this project. So if you were to think about how you would describe the climate of political discourse in our country right now, what comes to mind? Any words, what comes to mind? Feel free to shout it out.
Broken.
Savage, broken,
Toxic.
chaos. Okay.
Scary.
Yeah, hysteria. Sometimes a picture speaks more than 1,000 words. Let me see if I can get it here. So notice body language, facial expressions in these pictures. This is describing a lot of the words that we just heard, right? Political discourse is described as highly polarized, as negative, as toxic, as chaotic. And so the question that I was wanting to look at, and I love this picture, my colleague Brian Newman found this, I'm not really actually sure. The question is, does intellectual humility have something to offer in this complicated environment of political discourse? And if so, what and how? And so the projects that I've been working on, I will share on two of those today. One is looking at socio-political intellectual humility and how that relates to some outcomes that might be relevant to how people engage with others in the public sphere, especially around social and political topics, as well as looking at religion as a variable and various aspects of religion and how that might either promote or hinder socio-political intellectual humility. So that's what I'll be sharing about today, some of that work. So a little bit on what's been done already in this area. Intellectual humility has been associated with a number of favorable interpersonal qualities and characteristics that might benefit public discourse. But a lot of this work has focused on general intellectual humility. It's also possible to consider a domain-specific intellectual humility, and this came up in the discussion yesterday. I think Walter was asking about, well, does it matter, right? I might be humble about education, but not about the environment, or vice versa. So does the domain matter? And a lot of the domain-specific research on intellectual humility, so meaning asking people or assessing people in some way, evaluating them on intellectual humility in a particular content area, a lot of that has actually focused on religious intellectual humility. That's kind of been an area of early interest in this area. But I'm looking specifically at socio-political intellectual humility as the domain. And so Rick Hoyle in his work has developed a specific intellectual humility scale where you can basically plug in whatever your topical domain is to assess intellectual humility, for example, on politics. And he looked at politics among other topics and considered that as a particular form of intellectual humility, and found that people's intellectual humility on politics in this case, and this applies to other areas as well, will depend to a certain extent on their trait or characteristic levels of intellectual humility, but it will also depend on how extreme their views are on a particular topic. So that's where assessing the particular topic becomes, the domain-specific assessment becomes important, as well as the foundation for their viewpoints on that particular topic or area. And so there's very little research to date, though, that has assessed political or socio-political intellectual humility specifically, although there are a number of studies coming out that are focusing on assessing general intellectual humility, but looking at what the implications of that are for political discourse and the political arena. And so the studies being done there so far have highlighted that intellectual humility is associated with having more respectful attributions about other people's viewpoints, as well as a greater openness to learning about other people's beliefs in the political arena. But based on this, there seems to be an indication that it might be worthwhile to assess socio-political or political intellectual humility as a particular domain. So that's what I was doing with this research. So what I did was use the definition of intellectual humility that I've been working with, which is a non-threatening awareness of one's intellectual fallibility. That's kind of the general definition I've been working with. And then just framing that in terms of socio-political issues. And so, let me see what I've got here. The participants in this research were instructed, so I used the comprehensive intellectual humility scale, but instructed participants beforehand to think about their views about beliefs and ideas, topics relevant to society and politics, and then gave them a list of examples. So the list that you see up here was actually presented to the participants right before they completed the measure. And then the measure itself focuses on four. This is fairly small. Can you guys read this at all? Is it too little to see? Okay, just wanting to know how much to say versus let you read. So 4 domains of sociopolitical intellectual humility that I assessed. One being a healthy independence between intellect and ego, and this kind of gets at some of my interest in the psychological underpinnings of intellectual humility, and my thinking has been that it's the independence between intellect and ego, meaning that someone can have a secure sense of self that's independent of their beliefs, and therefore recognize that their beliefs are fallible, but that doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, or if someone disagrees with me, that there's something wrong between us. The other, so in this example item that you can see here, when someone contradicts my most important beliefs, it feels like a personal attack. That would be reverse scoring. That's an example item. Another component is openness to reconsidering one's viewpoints if warranted. So it doesn't mean that, again, you're going to, so Heather was talking about this yesterday, it doesn't mean that you're giving in all the time, agreeing with everyone, but that you are open to considering the evidence and information and then deciding whether or not to revise your viewpoints. So item there. Another component, respect for diverse ways of thinking. So the idea that people, agreeing with the idea that people have the right to their own opinions. So flat earthers have come up a number of times yesterday. So am I okay with the fact that people believe that the world is flat? Can I say, yes, you have the right to your beliefs on that? And then a lack of overconfidence in one's knowledge. So this is not about confidence, but about overconfidence and overlooking cognitive fallibility, overlooking cognitive biases that we know all humans are prone to, lacking awareness about those. Okay, so that's basically what I was looking at in terms of assessing sociopolitical intellectual humility. And so the first study that I'll share about, I'm going to not spend a ton of time on. The idea behind this project was to look at whether sociopolitical intellectual humility has something to contribute to the way people interact with others and their viewpoints about social groups and issues that might be relevant to public discourse. So this shows just a lot of details about the sample. The sample that I used was fairly representative of the US as a whole. I had fewer Latino participants, and my sample was slightly more educated, but otherwise fairly well mapping on to the US as a whole. There were a number of variables that I controlled in this research, including political party affiliation, household income, whether or not the person identified with a religion, and then also social desirability, to the extent to which people tended to respond in ways that they viewed as socially favorable. I'll group this kind of by category. The findings included that sociopolitical intellectual humility was predictive of less political intolerance of others, and this scale that I used, and most of the scales I used were validated measures, so there were a couple of areas where I wrote items for this research, but mostly used existing scales. The political intolerance scale was focusing on describing things like people who disagree with my political viewpoints, or people who have extreme views, things like that in general. I also looked at having people identify first what is the group that you disagree with most, so labeling a particular group, and you can see they selected out of 13 different groups with particular ideologies and identified first, yeah, this is the group, so that they have a particular group in mind, right? Because it's one thing to say people who disagree with me politically, it's another thing to say religious fundamentalists or whatever the group is that you might disagree with. And then complete items about the extent to which you would agree that people of this group should be able to run for office or have a political rally, those types of things in your community. And then that was also associated, so there was more political tolerance associated with sociopolitical intellectual humility, but the effect size was a little bit smaller. So once people were thinking of actual people, it's still there, but the effect went down a little bit in terms of size. Sociopolitical intellectual humility was associated with greater social justice attitudes and behavioral intentions, so prioritizing the rights and equality of all people regardless of their background, as well as less social dominance orientation, so the belief that all groups should be equal in society. Sociopolitical intellectual humility was also associated with having more favorable views of people who are making a political argument, so this kind of replicating some of the more recent studies as well, presenting them with someone describing their views on immigration, and then asking them to rate that person on 8 adjectives, both favorable and unfavorable adjectives about those individuals, and finding that they were more favorable regardless of their own, so regardless of participants' own viewpoints on the issue, as well as the extremity of their own viewpoints and how important the topic was to them. Regardless of all those things, intellectual humility was predicting more favorable, less unfavorable views of others. And sociopolitical intellectual humility was associated with more altruistic values, so the belief that people should take care of one another. Sociopolitical intellectual humility was predictive of less avoidance of political discussion, but interestingly also less civic engagement. So another way to frame this is that people who are lower in intellectual humility are more likely to avoid political discussion, but they may also be less motivated to get involved in civic activities, perhaps because they have less extreme views about their own perspective being involved. So this just summarizes what we just looked at. Sociopolitical intellectual humility tends to relate to positive views of other people and other groups, beneficial attitudes that might relate to this public atmosphere that we've been talking about. Although, again, that caveat, people might be less motivated to actually get involved in civic activities. So the second part that I want to focus on is whether religion, now knowing this context that sociopolitical intellectual humility seems to be relevant to the way people think about others, the attitudes that they bring into public discourse, my question was, does religion then either promote or form a barrier to people's levels of sociopolitical intellectual humility? So this is really small. There are some aliens out here saying, as near as I can tell, they're fighting over which religion is the most peaceful. So more seriously though, history and current events show us lots of examples of religious adherents feeling very strongly about their viewpoints and trying to force others to believe what they believe. And so one of the questions is whether, for example, if people believe that their beliefs are God-given beliefs, whether they would be less likely to be okay with the fallibility of those beliefs. That's a conundrum, right? However, on the other hand, some theologians have argued that it's in relation to an all-knowing God or a higher being that people can realize the fallibility of their own thinking. And perhaps also thinking about the potential underpinnings of intellectual humility, the idea of being, that not being threatening could exist in the context of a security or feeling loved by a greater being, then making you more comfortable with the fact that your thoughts are not perfect. And so there are also some Christian writings on this topic that have thought that engaging in religious worship among racially diverse individuals is associated with more mutual respect among different people, as well as the idea that intercessory prayer might increase love and humility towards perceived enemies. So these are some of the variables that I was interested in examining empirically to see what the research had to say about that. So most past research has focused on religious intellectual humility, as I was mentioning, with similar positive outcomes to socio-political intellectual humility that I was just focusing on in terms of experiences in groups. I won't go into this for the sake of time. Less research has examined religion as a predictor of intellectual humility in other areas, either general or socio-political intellectual humility. But the work that has been done has had mixed results. Some research finding no links between religion or spirituality and intellectual humility. Some research that I actually shared on last year at this workshop finding curvilinear links, where those who are in the middle with regard to religion are the lowest in intellectual humility, but those very low in religion or very high in religion are higher in intellectual humility. And some research, this is also from what I shared last year, focusing on religious participation predicting less intellectual humility over time with a fairly small effect. So this is what I was looking at in the research that I was doing for this project as well, and use a Christian sample for this. Here you can see the demographics. I won't spend too much time here. You can come back to it if you're interested in that. The analyses that I did were hierarchical regression analyses. I just want to highlight here that I, again, was controlling for a number of things, including social desirability, household income, whether they identified as politically liberal to conservative, because that actually accounted for more of the variance than simple political party affiliation. So this was a more stringent control, and then authoritarianism as well, which is relevant to assessing religious variables. And so the findings here are that, and what I was looking at with these analyses is I assessed people at 3 points in time, about 5 months apart, and then looked at and just to be simple, does the change in their religious variables predict change in their socio-political and subsequent change in their socio-political intellectual humility? And what I found is that increases in importance of religion to the person were associated with slight decreases in socio-political intellectual humility. And on the second sub-bullet, you can see what subscale of the intellectual humility scale that was mostly related to. So I'll just highlight that because it'll be the same on all these slides, and you can look at that. Increased importance of spirituality to the participants, same pattern as religion, was associated with slightly less socio-political intellectual humility. Increases in spiritual growth also were associated with slightly less socio-political intellectual humility. Some of the, and then here's a different pattern, increases in the racial and ethnic diversity of one's religious groups was associated with increases in socio-political intellectual humility. And then related to some of the subskills, there were also some findings. Increases in the time spent in prayer, in private religious activities was associated with decreases in willingness to revise one's socio-political viewpoints. And then greater respect for diverse ways of thinking, so this is one of the subscales of the intellectual humility scale that I used, was predicted by, and I flipped it here just because there's a whole list of things, praying for others more. Also, out of the percentage of time you spend praying for others, praying for those with different political views and praying for those with different religious views from oneself. Kind of similar patterns here, greater respect for diverse ways of thinking about socio-political topics was predicted by, in your private prayers, more frequent praying for the group you disagree with most. And here I plugged in that same label again of whoever they had identified before. In private prayers, more frequently praying for the country's political and social issues was associated with this as well. And less intellectual overconfidence, another component of intellectual humility that I looked at, was predicted by, in public prayers, praying for the group one disagrees with most, which corporate prayer may relate to, again, what type of religious group you're a part of, the type of religious group that maybe has a spiritual maturity to pray for those they disagree with. So some implications here. We have to first ask, are these meaningful links? Because any of you tracking the R-squared change, we're seeing very small percentages. We're talking here that changes in religious variables predicts up to 2% of the changes in socio-political intellectual humility. But I will say that we have to consider the stringent controls as well as the fact that we're looking at change in a naturalistic setting in people's lives without intervention within a relatively short period of time, 5 months of normal life. So we're not seeing a lot of change in religiosity or a lot of change necessarily in socio-political intellectual humility during 5 months of an average person's life. So the question is there enough here to say that there might be something, if we did interventions, we might find stronger effects? And then my final point here is that increases in general indicators of religiosity seem to be associated with slight decreases in socio-political intellectual humility. But when we look at more specific religious activities, so the things like intercultural worship, praying, particular types of praying for particular types of people, that those are associated with more socio-political intellectual humility. So the pattern here is that if we're asking, does religion matter? We have to say yes, but it depends on what kind of religion. In terms of what the effects are, depends on what kind of religion you're talking about. And so in terms of future directions, it would be interesting to see the links that I started with, socio-political intellectual humility linked to political tolerance, social justice, less social dominance and altruism, whether that is kind of mediated through religion, right? With religion, in this case general religion, decreasing socio-political intellectual humility is what accounts for some of the negative stuff happening in society surrounding religion, versus on the other hand, whether specific religious behaviors that we were looking at increase socio-political intellectual humility, whether that's accounting for some of the positive things we might see in society and in public discourse in terms of the themes that we started with. And so this would be something to assess again with longitudinal data, preferably with causal models, and something that might be interesting to look into further to see if it all links up in this way. So I think I'm out of time, right?
Almost.
Almost, okay. Well, I think I made it through the main points.
Thank you. Elizabeth Krumrei Mancuso is an associate professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. Our next speaker is Ruth Braunstein. She is an assistant professor of sociology here at UConn, and the title of her talk is Beyond the Dogmatic Believer, Religious Conviction Across the American Political Divide.
Great. Thank you. And I also want to thank Michael and Brendan and everyone involved with the Humility, Conviction, and Public Life Project. Part of what I'm going to be sharing today came out of a conference that I was fortunate to get to help organize in April of 2017 that looked at the role of religion in sort of this tension between conviction and humility in American public life, and it brought together sociologists, theologians, political scientists, some philosophers who were sort of studying sort of actually existing religious groups and their interactions in public life to think about how they manage this tension. And so if you're interested in some of those people, the thoughts that came out of that, we published some of those essays at The Imminent Frame, and then we're actually working on a special issue of a journal called Political Power and Social Theory. And so I'm going to share today some of my sort of overarching conclusions that came out of that. I should say thoughts rather than conclusions. Sort of some orienting questions that I now have when I think about sort of the role of religion in this tension. And so I want to start off with sort of a snapshot of religion in public life in America today. And the snapshot is sort of around this really dramatic statistic, the 81%. So who knows what the 81% is? Has anyone heard of this? Coming out of the 2016 presidential election, one of the sort of infamous statistics that came out of that was that 81% of white evangelical Christians in the United States voted for Donald Trump. And this was in spite of the fact that throughout the campaign, there was a huge amount of focus on his sort of public moral failings, his moral failings in terms of his, his marriages, his adultery, sort of the fact that he sort of, lavishes wealth and sort of is not modest, and all of these things that we would think would be disgusting to evangelical Christians based on their past sort of taste in presidential candidates who did not have, and yet they supported Donald Trump. So in an article in Christianity Today that was sort of discussing the importance of the statistic, they say over the past 2 years, few statistics have sparked as much debate both inside and outside evangelicalism as the fact that 81% of white evangelical voters picked Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Journalists went down into evangelical towns and studied them and sort of painted this picture essentially of people who would not even consider changing their mind about Donald Trump. They were 100% committed to Donald Trump. They wouldn't even consider any other options. And sort of painted them as this sort of blind herd. Even after the election, in spite of all these debates, based on the 2018 American Values Survey done by Public Religion Research Institute, they found that 70% of white evangelicals still hold a favorable view of Trump just ahead of the midterm elections, and 25% of them reported there is nothing Trump could do to lose their support. And so, these are really kind of staggering figures, despite the huge amount of conversation that's been happening about this. And so, this is a sort of a fact pattern, this 81% number that supports a narrative that we have about the role of religion in politics, and particularly the sort of way that religious believers sort of engage in politics in the United States. And I call this the dogmatic believer narrative. And so, when we talk about the 81%, it really fuels this narrative, but it's a narrative that existed long before the 81% and exists sort of in the way that many of our fields think about the role of religion in politics. And so, when we think about religion as dogmatic belief rather than as something broader, it becomes a really problematic source of closed-mindedness, of intractability, of impermeability to reason, Nothing you can tell me will change my mind. And this supports sort of within political theory, both substantive and procedural concerns about the role of religion in the public sphere, right? So substantively, we think of, this is gonna support sort of closed-mindedness toward others, right? Which might lead to certain kinds of policies that would, be sort of unliberal, anti-liberal. And then procedurally, at least, is concerned that, religious believers cannot engage in open-minded, rational dialogue with fellow citizens. And so, right, religion becomes something that needs to be left outside of the public sphere. And these concerns dovetail with some of the concerns that people engaged in conversations about humility and conviction think about, in the sense that when we frame religion as dogmatic belief, right, it becomes this sort of problematic source of arrogance, right? Too much arrogance, not enough humility. And so, right, it's an easy narrative to fall into, especially in our current moment, right, when we see people screaming at each other, and a lot of those people are very strongly religious. But the problem is that religion does not equal dogmatic belief, right? The dogmatic believer is only one flavor, if we think of it of American religion. And even when we think of religion as something broader than dogmatic belief, or as dogmatic belief, right, the dogmatic believer narrative is overly simplistic about dogmatic belief itself. And so, right, we have to really think more broadly about how religion works in the context of this, right? So religious dogmatism, like all dogmatism, right, does seem to be an impediment to achieving an optimal balance between conviction and humility, right? Dogmatism, by definition, is the kind of antithesis of humility. But we can't draw general conclusions about religion based on the dogmatic believer narrative. Like I said, it's oversimplistic in its account of dogmatic belief, and it only captures one aspect of American religion, right? We can think of, first of all, white evangelicals are only one slice of the American religious landscape. There's variation in terms of religious tradition, political affiliation, other kinds of socio-cultural variation. And so we have to kind of decenter this narrative, even though it is at the center of our sort of politics and the way we talk about religion. And so I'm going to sort of, right, that was one snapshot, right? The dogmatic believer is this one really visible snapshot. I'm going to give you two more snapshots that are going to sort of, in my mind, sort of help me as stress test how we think about the role religion plays in this tension between conviction and humility in public life. And so the second snapshot is what I call the humble believer. And again, looking at evangelical Christians in the United States, one way that we can look at this is in the shift that we've seen in views about homosexuality among evangelical Protestants. And one of the people that presented at our conference, a colleague of mine named Dawn Moon and her colleague Teresa Tobin, have been doing ethnographic research in a number of communities where evangelicals are coming together and really trying to think about how to be somewhere between accepting and affirming of evangelicals within their communities. And a lot of these conversations are starting because, their child comes out to them as gay, or one of their best friends, or a member of their congregation. And they really are trying to sort of think hard about how do I reconcile, the sort of biblical command to love my neighbors, right? And not to judge others with this idea that I have that homosexuality is evil. They're doing things like reading the Bible together and learning new things about what Scripture says, and really challenging themselves. And so through, contexts like this and a variety of other changes, including generational change where younger people are more open to this than older people, but also attitude change by older people. It's not just sort of a generational shift. We're also seeing changing attitudes. There's this huge jump, right? So between 2007 and 2014, a blip, right? You moved from 26% who believe that even homosexuality should be accepted to 36%, and this is a longer term trend that we're seeing. There's also some really interesting research that just came out by a colleague of mine, Jonathan Coley, where he's studying how young people are dealing with this on Christian college campuses. So he has this great statistic that I just want to share, that 45% of Christian campuses in the United States have officially recognized LGBT groups, and 55% have adopted non-discrimination statements inclusive of sexual orientation. And that's not just what we would think of as liberal Christian college campuses. That includes some that are theologically conservative. And so these are kind of surprising changes in light of that first dogmatic believer narrative. Now these are, in many cases, white evangelicals. They are, by their own definition, right, dogmatic believers, right? There are certain things that are just fundamentally true to them in terms of how they answer survey questions. And yet, there's a humility in terms of thinking through some of these questions, and often that humility comes through relationships with others, shifting sort of political context where maybe an issue stops being such a sort of a non-negotiable in terms of how their leaders are framing it, right? And you can look at sort of these larger sort of cultural shifts that make this possible. And so, right, sort of how do we think about the difference in these two pictures of the same religious group, right, evangelical Protestants in the US? And so this leads us to say, right, does religion, instead of leading to sort of dogmatism, should we actually be saying, does religion lead to a certain kind of open-mindedness, right? Because it's actually in the context of religious community that people are changing their minds on this issue. And right, sort of, we can sort of look for reasons why that might be the case. In fact, most faith traditions formally encourage humility. There's sort of practices and teachings that sort of say humility is important, understanding one's infallibility, right? As Liz was talking about, particularly in the context of, you know, this all-knowing God. Of course, how much more humble can you feel, right? So we should believe this shouldn't actually be surprising in light of that. Putnam and Campbell also talk about this thing called the Aunt Susan principle when they look at the United States. And they're asking this question of how can the country be sort of simultaneously devout, but also ultimately kind of diverse and accepting of difference. And they basically argue that given high levels of diversity in the United States, even the most devout Americans have relationships with religious and moral others that ultimately make them more tolerant of difference, right? So if your Aunt Susan is gay, you kind of have to grapple with this, and your relationship might ultimately supersede your fundamental belief about this. And that could be true of anything, right? Your Aunt Susan votes for Bernie Sanders, your Aunt Susan, you know, is a vegetarian, whatever those things are, you have to sort of grapple with that. And so again, religion might support open-mindedness in that context. And then of course, religious groups, like any other group, might just have strategic reasons for shifting the sort of, you know, sort of official stance on certain issues related to sort of power and other kinds of issues that are important to them, particularly those that are formally politically active. And so, right, we can sort of, based on these two snapshots, say maybe humility nor arrogance are intrinsic to religion, right? But that we have to look at these broader factors, and this is the sociologist in me saying, right, social context, right, shifting cultural norms, political forces, social network configurations are going to shape, right, in addition to the particular sort of domain that we're looking at, you know, how religious groups are handling any particular issue and how humble or, you know, arrogant they might see around an issue. So finally, I'm going to sort of offer a third snapshot. It was a little different from the second two, but this is what, you know, we sort of have this dogmatic believer, humble believer. This is a sort of righteous prophet, right? It's another vision of religion that sort of often comes up. This is sort of central to my own research. And so this is a cover of the Catholic Agitator, which is a publication of the Catholic Worker, a sort of radical left religious movement in the United States that, you know, you can look through all their back issues in their newspapers. There's lots of these kinds of images of biblical prophets. And, right, so this says, I'm still crazy after all these years. Many in Israel found the prophets unintelligible. Most dismissed them as fanatic dreamers who preached a naive idealism, divorced from the moral ambiguities of the real world. Right, they're identifying with these sort of crazy prophets who are not listening to what other people say, pushing past, right, arrogant, dogmatic, right, unwilling to listen to others, completely confident in themselves, right? And yet we're lifting them up as politically good, right? And as sort of role models. And you see the sort of idealization of the righteous prophet in, you know, sort of texts like Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, right? Where he writes, although I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, and this is after he actually identifies with biblical prophets. As I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? And he actually lists a number of other both religious and political figures. So the question is not whether we'll be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? And this is a way that a number of liberal left political groups in the United States frame themselves. They frame themselves as sort of heirs to biblical prophets, standing up, sort of speaking truth to justice, not being willing to back down. And a number of these groups also happen to sort of be, within the United States context, racially, ethnically marginalized groups. And so speaking, sort of identifying with prophets, gives them a kind of confidence in speaking up for themselves in a context that would otherwise maybe dismiss their kinds of political arguments. And so what does this snapshot sort of help us to think through, right? It sort of begs this question of, is arrogance always bad? right? So the first two snapshots really share a common conclusion, right? And that's that excessive moral certainty closes down the possibility of open-minded dialogue and drives polarization is a problem for democratic life, right? So in that first one, the sort of dogmatic believer is closed-minded and bad. In the second one, they become more humble and good, right? In this case, they're sort of saying maybe strong religious convictions, right, fuels moral certainty, and that's actually good. That can be good for democracy in this sort of substantial way, right? It helps citizens to advance democratic aims. But the question then becomes whose arrogance is virtuous, right? Not only when is arrogance virtuous, but whose. And this, I think, sort of connects back with some of the talks yesterday. Because in order to sort of think through this question, we have to kind of step back and think about the context in which people are acting. And the sort of context is that most public spaces and institutions, particularly in the United States, are not actually these kind of level playing fields of democratic discourse that we might imagine them to be. And in fact, there's sometimes this sort of epistemically hostile environment, is the term I'm borrowing from Heather Godley, and that these environments discredit members of non-dominant groups, particularly women and people of color. So when you're operating in what we might think of as an epistemically hostile environment, right, marginalized groups may choose to embrace a kind of sort of dogmatic stance, what they would call prophetic stance, in order to sort of sustain confidence in their humanity, their right to be heard, sort of the courage of my convictions, stand up to oppressors. It's important to note that this might produce conflict and polarization, but that's kind of considered a means to an end, which is that the only way to actually correct the context, right, to move past this, is to produce that conflict and polarization and ultimately move toward a sort of a less sort of undemocratic situation, which then would maybe allow them to have the kind of discourse that we would imagine, right, where they can be more humble. So, some big ideas coming from these sort of three different snapshots of religion in American public life. So there's two sets of conclusions I want to draw. And one is kind of analytic, like as we think about how to assess the effect of religion on this tension between conviction and humility, it suggests that we need sort of to be thinking about a more complex set of relationships between religious conviction, humility, and democracy. That strong religious conviction can, of course, encourage greater political arrogance, but it can also encourage greater humility. It can lead to deepening polarization that threatens democracy, but also commitment to causes that advance democracy, that it's sort of both, and we need to look more specifically at the context in order to understand that. It also requires, in order to see that, attention to these social contextual factors that are driving each outcome. So thinking about power, history, context, culture, institutions, all these things that are sort of, religious groups are embedded within in order to understand how they're acting. And then the second set of conclusions has to do with our own kind of normative biases in terms of how we're approaching these questions. And so, right, it's important to remember that my kind of democratically good, righteous prophet, right, might be another person's democratically problematic, dogmatic believer, and vice versa. And so, right, this might be stemming from, we might have different conceptions of what is democratic, right? Some of those might be sort of a substantive versus a procedural kind of definition. Some of them might be different substantive definitions of the good, right? Of sort of who is morally good and who is morally bad. And so, right, whenever we're talking about these, right, I layered my own kind of assumptions on those cases in terms of who I considered problematic and who I considered good, right? And sort of having to be really reflexive about where our own politics and morals are entering into that, right, is necessary. And then also related to this, right, thinking that sort of leads us to sort of thinking about whose arrogance is virtuous versus whose arrogance is problematic. But also, right, thinking about this question of whose willingness to change is good. And so, right, the example that I gave of evangelical Christians changing their minds about homosexuality, that's something that I think is ultimately both morally and democratically good, right? But what if we substituted a different scenario for that? What if we substituted sort of white secular liberals changing their mind on the moral goodness of white supremacy, right? They were being open-minded, they were listening to white supremacists, they're rethinking their presuppositions about this. I don't think we would necessarily all agree that willingness to change your mind about a sort of fundamental moral issue is necessarily always good, right? So this is, of course, where sort of power enters into this and a variety of other questions. But again, it also has to do with our own set of sort of moral and political priors in terms of how we're thinking about this. So I will end there, and thank you very much. I look forward to our conversation.
Our last speaker is Ryan Kennedy. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of Houston, and the title of the presentation is Intellectual Humility and Discursive Participation in Politics.
All right, thank you so much. And I have a ton of thank yous with this, not only with my co-PIs, but of course to Michael and all the people who have organized this fantastic event, to the Templeton Foundation, to Congressional Management Foundation, Kettering, National Issues Forum, a whole bunch of others who will see, an army of undergraduates and graduate students who help with all the moderation, everything else. This is a lot of people who all contributed to this project. What we were interested in is this idea of public versus private deliberation, or another way we put it is monological versus dialogical deliberation. So there have been a whole bunch of studies suggesting that deliberation has a bunch of really good properties. It increases knowledge, it increases engagement, people generally seem to enjoy it and want to participate in it. But the problem is that it's expensive. Trying to get people together requires time, requires effort. You've got to put together materials, you've got to arrange the moderators, all these kind of things. And so there's been an increasing interest in this idea of deliberation within, or private deliberation, or monological deliberation. How can we perhaps expose people to ideas that they might not otherwise be exposed to? And could this have some of those same beneficial properties? And we see this with, for example, Facebook trying to alter their algorithm a little bit so that people get some news stories they otherwise wouldn't see. Groups like ProCon that try to do the pros and cons of different issues. Or Voice of the People, which was a polling group that tried to expose people to counter-arguments in order to get this kind of public judgment idea of what attitudes were. But there really hasn't been a comparison on this. To the extent that we've compared deliberation versus an alternative, usually it was giving people reading materials and then hoping that they read them, which the evidence suggested they didn't. So, what we did as we were looking, a few things, there's a lot to introduce here, and that's part of the reason why I'm talking so fast. We were utilizing a format called Common Ground for Action, and this is, try to get this going. So Common Ground for Action was a platform that was built with Kettering Foundation as well as with the National Issues Forum. And it's an online deliberation platform that took people through all the various steps of deliberation in an interactive text-based format. So people would go through, they would rank their preferences, they would tell a personal story about it, they'd have videos and background readings that they would have, and then they would engage in discussions with people along with interactive visualizations of the group consensus or lack thereof. By the way, this is a free of charge platform that we are encouraging other people to utilize for their own research. So I've heard a couple of people say we're interested in seeing what happens when we do this online. Here it's a flexible platform. As long as you don't need people to actually be face-to-face, it's quite a flexible platform that we've used in a number of different ways that we encourage people to utilize. We're recently shifting it over to Ohio State as the group that's running this. And what we do is we compared it against different monological versions of the same kind of idea, right? So in one case, we gave people the background materials, the videos, the counter-argument, and we had them they could run through them, and they didn't really have to read it. They could have skipped things if they wanted to. The other thing is we did like a force, what we call our public deliberation treatment, where people were given these things, and then we didn't let them have the next arrow until after the time had elapsed in which they would need to watch the video. So it's either you watch a still screen or you click play and watch the video that is offered to you discussing this issue. And so we're really trying to compare it where people actually received the information in one way or another. And so it was designed to be very similar to CGA's, except that it did not include the discussion element. So everything else was included but the discussion. And this will, I have to pause it before okay, there we go. All right. We did 4 studies, and all of them had different aspects to them. First thing we were interested in, so there were a bunch of CGAs that have been done across time in various formats, and one of the things we wanted to take a look at is the demographic patterns online versus real person, live person interaction. So along with Templeton, National Issues Forum, Penn State University, a whole bunch of others, we got 1,609 participants in 275 forums that we could actually look at how participation worked in these online forums. We also conducted comparison dealing with deliberation on immigration, which we conducted in cooperation with Senators Tillis and Crapo and the Congressional Management Foundation, where we recruited constituents within their districts and brought them in. 198 people participated in 47 forums using the CGA platform. And then 102 were put into the private deliberation simulation that we had put together, and 102 were put into the control group where they were not forced to actually ingest the information. They could just simply click through if they wanted to. The third one, this is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing it. It was a blown experiment. We had this great group from the state of Ohio to discuss the Ohio opioid epidemic. Had law enforcement, pharmaceutical companies, we had members of state and national government, and we put together all these materials. We conducted 78 sessions with 444 participants in the PGAs, or in the CGAs, but unfortunately our survey company blew the other treatment conditions. So the good news is that they have agreed to make it right. The bad news is that we've been going through IRB hell, and just 4 days ago finally got the final approval to do a national version of this. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this. Lastly, measuring intellectual humility. So we were using Elizabeth's, this is actually kind of fortuitous, we were using measure of intellectual humility, and we did some things to try and build on this, particularly looking at whether unfolding occurs within intellectual humility. And so I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. All right, so let's talk about who participates. So across the CGAs, one of the big debates about deliberation is within the sessions there tends to be a problem, especially gender has received a lot of attention. Karpowitz and Mendenhall. I think Betsy talked about this yesterday, how young men could be so rude in these sessions. Well, the question was, does this actually come across in an online format? And what we found is that while there were differences in terms of gender, actually in terms of the number of words, so the actual amount of content that was brought into the sessions, women were about equal to men in this regard. And in large part, we attribute that to the text-based format. That when you're doing it in a text-based format, because you'll notice women do have fewer chats, but they have about the same number of words, meaning that they're actually giving longer comments. And there's less ability to interrupt in a text-based format. However, we did find other groups that were disadvantaged in this format, particularly non-white groups and those who were older, 65 and older. Interestingly, we found out the middle-aged people, my peeps, were quite good in terms of getting a large number of chats involved in there. I attribute that to we're the last generation to actually have typing classes, right? In terms of satisfaction with the outcome, so at the end they're presented with a common ground and say, how do you like this? We actually found women were a little bit, and as well as older people, tend to be a little bit more appreciative of what the common ground that was produced, although those weren't statistically significant. However, non-white participants were on average less satisfied with the outcomes in terms of common ground. We also, because we had so many sessions, we could look at the effect of the session characteristics. Because, especially when it comes to gendered participation, the role of a female in power or the role of a larger number of females participating is very important. And what we found is that indeed having a female moderator did make it more likely for women to be satisfied with the outcomes of deliberation and did not affect male satisfaction. And then this is going to make men look really bad. We found out that increased female participation, the general theory is that the more women participate, the more women are going to be satisfied with the outcomes of deliberation. Actually, what we found was that the more women participate, the less satisfied men were with the outcomes of deliberation. So guys, come on. This is really... all right. Well, let's get to the meat of the matter, the private versus public deliberation. On the opioids one, here we're comparing against the true control, where people did not have any kind of deliberation. We did find that people did change their attitudes, in particular Democrats, Independents, Republicans. All of them became more supportive of recovery networks and short-term interventions in order to address the opioid epidemic. We presented this to policymakers to suggest that there was actually pretty broad support for these attitudes. People who participate in CGAs also reported being more recognizing of trade-offs with the policies that they supported previously. And they respected the opinions of other people more than they did before they went into the deliberation sessions. Going to the immigration sessions where we actually had the control groups that we wanted. So these are all estimated. We used multiple measures of all these contexts like satisfaction and whether people change their mind, etc. Estimated them in a hierarchical, fully Bayesian model, blah, blah, blah. So for example, when I talk about satisfaction, we're talking about a combination of questions like how satisfied are you with the sessions? How important do you think that these kinds of sessions are in a democracy? How much do you think this would be useful, or do you think this would be useful for your member of Congress to hear what came out of these sessions, things like that. And what we found was that comparing public to private deliberation, the levels of satisfaction were very different. So here you have the control, which is where people could skip the information. You had the private deliberation, where people were forced to view the information in one shape or form, and you had the public deliberation, which included the discussion. And what we found was that people's satisfaction was much higher and their attitudes toward deliberation were much more positive when they had the public deliberation experience. In terms of changing mind, what we found was definitely a difference versus the control, and marginally significant difference between the private deliberation and the public deliberation. Interestingly, in terms of knowledge about immigration, we found that those who did the private deliberation part had a higher level of knowledge afterwards, but we attribute this to two things. Number one is that the only incentive the people in the public deliberation had to actually read the stuff and watch the videos was that they knew they were going to have to discuss them later on. We didn't actually force them to do it. And also there was more time between when they reviewed the materials and actually took the test versus the people who were in and given that, the fact that we don't find a highly statistically significant difference between the two groups is actually somewhat interesting. In terms of people's attitudes or feelings about the immigration issue, we see that in terms of their enthusiasm about the issue, that this is actually greatly increased by public deliberation versus private deliberation, has no significant distinguishable difference with the control group. However, anger we found was not affected by either of these. In terms of efficacy, we found that internal efficacy and trust in government were not really affected by either condition. However, we did find a significant difference in external efficacy when people participated in the public discussions. Finally, we found that some of these effects were contingent. So for example, need for cognition, so people's willingness to try to gain understanding. This dramatically affected a couple of different things. In terms of changing your mind, those who were high in need for cognition were the ones who were most likely to be affected by the discourse condition. And in fact, those who didn't have much need for cognition, as you might expect, just basically shut out the discussion and didn't change their minds about much of anything. In terms of knowledge, the knowledge gains for those people who were in the forced condition also were mostly in those people who had high need for cognition. We guess that people who are low in need for cognition were the ones more likely to just sit there staring at a screen that wasn't moving. Also, in terms of conflict avoidance, we found that those people with low conflict avoidance were those who were most satisfied with public discussion. And we also found that they were the ones who were most likely to have their minds changed. And you may be wondering about intellectual humility. One of the things we did, so we included a short version of Elizabeth's scale, and we didn't really find much in the way of interaction, which was surprising to us. And so we had an opportunity to get some questions on the CCES survey, and we thought, okay, let's go ahead and try doing an analysis of the scale, see what happens. And so what we did was we took the scale, expanded out the number of items, so we had a total of 44 balanced items with planned missingness so that we didn't overwhelm the entire CCS survey. Michael Neblo, one of the co-PIs on this, had this idea, similar to what Heather was talking about yesterday, about whether or not intellectual humility was an attitude or a virtue, right? So with an attitude like need for cognition, you can see people being high or low on need for cognition. There's not really a too high a need for cognition. Versus with virtues, here you have the example of courage, right? If you are too courageous, you are foolhardy. If you are not courageous, you are cowardly. Like there is a little bit of a distinction between. Similarly with intellectual humility, having conviction isn't bad if you're not arrogant. And on the other hand, you don't want to have so much humility that you are diffident, right? So what we thought is that maybe there's a little bit of unfolding that's going on here. And so what we did was we took a test to see if you had unfolding in the intellectual humility scale. And what you see here is a plot of the dominance scores, which is the traditional kind of Likert way of aggregating questions, right, using factor analysis. Compared to the unfolding scores, which the best analogy I could give, political scientists are probably going to be the ones most familiar with this, is it's kind of like ideal point estimation. And what we found was that so for items like need for cognition, there's no unfolding. It is a 45-degree line, everybody is on it. However, for intellectual humility, we did find a significant amount of unfolding that is going on here. So for example, you have some people over here who on the dominance scores would actually be coded as somewhat politically humble, but then when we unfold it, they end up coming down here at the very bottom of the scale, which would tend to suggest these are the people who are really arrogant, right? They are always giving the response of not being humble even on the questions which have a sharp division between groups. And in particular, we find this on certain subscales more than others. So really where we find the most unfolding is in the lack of individual overconfidence, where we have a very large amount of unfolding that seems to be happening here, suggesting that what we're getting is a certain amount of distinction between those who are humble versus diffident, or who are who have conviction versus are arrogant. Future work. So we've got a lot of things that are happening in the future. I've already mentioned that we're going to be doing the national opioids version. Just got approval for it, so now we've got to ramp up all of our moderators again and get everything going with that. We're continuing work on the measurement scales, finding out well, what is the actual impact of using an unfolded scale versus a traditional scale, things like that. The problem, of course, with unfolded scales is that short forms are really difficult with unfolding, so I'm not exactly sure if we're going to be able to, how we're going to do this. We've got some other things going on, like I'm part of the IARPA's hybrid forecasting competition, and so we actually got a listed scale onto the hybrid forecasting competition to see if intellectual humility helps people make better forecasts in the presence of advice from others and computer models. We've got a big project now. Kevin Esterling, one of the co-PIs, is now a part of the American Political Science Association task force that is advising the subcommittee for the modernization of Congress. And interestingly, him and by proxy, our group is the only one that's dealing with political communication, which if you look at the subcommittee, that is like the main thing that the subcommittee is really interested in. So we've got this great opportunity to introduce some of the deliberative practices that we've been studying into actual congressional workflows and communication procedures as a way to help them cut through the huge amounts of noise that they are receiving. And we're continuing on with our work about testing and working on what Neblo, Esterling, and Lazar called directly representative democracy, and a whole bunch of experiments with congressional offices dealing with various ways to incorporate new technologies to implement these procedures. So with that, I think I'm going to leave it here. Say once again, thank you to everyone who made this possible, and look forward to your comments and questions.
We
Robert?
Yeah, thank you. This is a question for Ruth. So religious conviction poses two broad challenges for participatory/deliberative democratic theory, and your presentation discussed one of them, which is what we might think of as the fervor with which religiously convicted citizens hold their religious conviction, which, as you point out, might be positively correlated, but maybe not, with other kinds of undesirable traits like closed-mindedness, unwillingness to listen to those who don't agree, so on and so forth. I take it that the other challenge is also important, and I'm wondering if the data that you've collected speak to it. And the other challenge is that it doesn't have so much to do with the fervor or the comportment that the religious believer takes towards his faith convictions, but rather the willingness, or lack thereof, of the religious believer to see the deliverances of his religious conviction to be sufficient grounds upon which to advocate for public policy. So it seems to me that's a separate issue, right? And you could be open-minded about with respect to your comportment to the deliverances of your faith tradition, but still think that once I'm clear about what those deliverances are and have been open-minded about hearing other folks speak about their conflicting convictions, nonetheless, the fact that the Pope has issued an encyclical that says states ought to fy or fying ought to be prohibited, that's sufficient for me to think that I should advocate, including vote, on the basis simply of that reason. And it seems to me that that's a different kind of challenge that religious conviction poses. So I wonder if you see anything in your data that suggests that in the case of the humble religious convicted believer, that increased humility is also correlated in any way, in any direction, with a willingness to see either the deliverances of one's faith tradition as not sufficient for public advocacy, or with a positive disposition to go seek in one's public advocacy reasons that are accessible to citizens as such, no matter what their religious tradition is.
Yeah, I mean, the case that comes to mind when you say that is sort of Democrats, particularly Catholic Democrats in recent years, who get asked about abortion, right? And their answer is, my personal moral beliefs toward abortion are consistent with the sort of official stance of my faith tradition, right? I am pro-life. I do not believe it's appropriate for me to sort of create law based on that, and we have to sort of find common moral ground on this. And so, right, I think that part of what I would sort of call for is that we have to look at sort of the specifics of almost every kind of faith tradition as an organization, and particularly as a political organization. And so in the Catholic Church, right, you have a very clear set of teachings. You have organizations that are dedicated to actually helping people to figure out how to make these connections between the church's official teachings and how they can behave in political life. And right, organizations are constantly engaged in sort of advocacy, both officially towards sort of like Congress and lawmakers, but also to their publics, right, to people in the pews, trying to sort of help them think through the relationship between these things. And that's actually in itself a part of politics for these faith communities, is actually trying to figure out how to make these connections. On the other side, you sort of see really varying levels across different faith communities, levels of adherence to the official statements of their leadership. And so there's right, variation in terms of the relationship between leadership and the people in the pews. And so in the Catholic Church, right, within sort of on some issues and in some time periods, you see very strict sort of adherence to, if the bishops sort of issue a particular kind of guidance on something, we all follow that and vote that way and advocate for that, right? In the mainline, and one of the reasons why there's been huge sort of debates and schisms within a number of mainline churches is there's a really big political divide between the leadership and the sort of official statements of, you know, right now the Methodist Church, for example, and people in the pews, where people in the pews are far more conservative on a number of issues than the leadership. And so the leadership is saying, you know, we have a certain set of social principles, which would say that we need to prioritize, you know, social justice issues, X, Y, and Z. And people in the pews are saying, no, we need to prioritize abortion, and right. And so I think that these are organizational dilemmas within these traditions. And so as a sociologist, I'm interested in sort of those organizational dynamics. And I think that we can't kind of say, draw one set of conclusions about that without looking at what's happening inside of these organizations. So that would be sort of my sort of take on that, yeah.
Thank you. Lady on this side.
Oh, yeah. So I have a question for Elizabeth. So I think you said that sociopolitical humility was correlated with less civic engagement. I was wondering if you had any data on whether like the importance in religion also decreased or increased civic engagement?
I did not look at that. I could with the data that I have. So the question is whether religion is related to the civic engagement. I don't know. I didn't look at that, but I could. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Feel free to email me to
Okay,
remind me.
awesome.
I'll check that out for you.
Thanks. Paul?
Oh, hi. It's for Ruthie, although I enjoyed all the presentations. I would like to encourage you to reconsider the idea that arrogance can be a virtue and that an extremist for justice would be arrogant in any way. Most theories of arrogance involve some sort of disrespect towards other people that you're being arrogant to, and so it seems inconsistent with the idea of being virtuous. And I don't think that King was arrogant.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that that's right. I mean, I'm sort of using the term arrogant, you know, in a sort of a stand-in for closed-mindedness in a particular context, right? So this idea that I'm going to say what I think and nothing that you say is going to convince me otherwise. In that sort of, in this sort of particular kind of interaction, and Letter for Birmingham Jail is a useful kind of example for me, right? Because he's essentially saying, I'm not going to engage in what you would consider appropriate kinds of democratic interactions. I'm not going to negotiate. I'm not going to engage in dialogue. I'm going to protest.
Well,
and so, King.
But that's, I mean, he lays out 4 steps of direct action, and
Sure.
negotiation is the second of them.
But they're saying at this moment, right? I'm done doing this, right?
Right,
We're
yeah,
at this-
yes, yeah.
Sure. And so it's sort of specifically pushing back on this idea that there's this sort of a fair back and forth that I can have on this issue at this point in time. And so I'm not going to do that anymore. But at the same time, in the same letter, he calls for humility, right? And so it's this much more complex kind of statement, but you know, in sort of one way of looking at that, if you were not thinking about that as a statement by a person that we considered a democratic sort of saint, right? You could read some of those statements. I was just sort of trying to sort of say as arrogant, right? As sort of closed-minded, as more intractable, right? If we think about those as sort of like synonyms for the kinds of groups that we would think of as arrogant. Just the idea of being sort of a righteous prophet and sort of prophetic in your statement, being sort of, I am sure of what I'm saying. It is God's word, right? And therefore it stands above any kind of debate we can have. Lonnie?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that follows on from what Paul was saying, really, but just looking at the last 2 questions you had, whose arrogance is virtuous and his willingness to change is always good. And it seems like, yeah, if we're talking about virtue, then the missing piece of the puzzle for me here is that there is a motivational component. And so when we think about arrogance, as that does sound like an oxymoron to me, but partly because arrogance has this like motivational component that is inherently kind of not gonna, even if it ends up having a positive effect, we can't think of it as virtuous because of that motivational component, like the disrespect perhaps. And then in the other way, the willingness to change, it seems to me that where your example, liberals taking on open-mindedly the views of white supremacists seems like the effect is perhaps not one we're looking, the actual change is not one we're looking for, but the willingness, the motivation or component to change, being open to change might always be a good thing, even if the change isn't. And again, it's that motivational piece of the puzzle that needs to be in place in order to be talking about it in terms of virtue or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe that would be the case. I'm just encouraging us to think through that as the alternative scenario, right? Like if we put other groups as stand-ins for the groups that we're thinking about, right? Do we draw the same kinds of conclusions? And the only other case I would put out there is that in terms of sort of whose arrogance is virtuous. And I should say, I'm using the words arrogant and virtuous with like lowercase a and v, and like sort of like not as sort of, you know, in a formal kind of way. But right, the answer, the conclusion that I think a number of people draw would be that if you're sort of in a socially marginalized position, then a certain kind of dogmatism in sort of standing up for yourself can be appropriate in order to sort of not be shut down. In the context of oppression. But I think we also have to look at sort of the perceptions of oppression. So there's a lot of research showing that white evangelical Christians in the United States imagine themselves as marginalized, as embattled, as actually as sort of existing in an epistemically hostile secular environment. And so they would say that they have the exact, they're as sort of strident as they are because of that. And so, right, even really sort of stress testing this question of sort of who do sort of we imagine as marginalized and whose voices sort of, right, sort of get to do this thing that we might in other contexts think of as appropriate. You know, just the entire, it's sort of imagined as sort of a set of thought experience to help us question those assumptions.
Okay. Thank you. Jacqueline?
Yeah, I had a question for Elizabeth. So you mentioned that your measure of humility was correlated with social dominance orientation and social justice concerns. So to what extent is humility, the way you measured it, imbalanced along political ideology? And is it a linear relationship? Because that sounds to me like liberals are more humble, you know. But then also, is it does it change depending on extremity?
So in terms of the political identification, there was a negative link between identifying with the Republican Party and socio-political intellectual humility. There was no significant link for the Democratic Party or other, you know, independent or unsure categories. And that was captured then in kind of the liberal to conservative on that domain, that the more conservatives would score lower in terms of the socio-political intellectual humility. What was the second part of the...
If it was a linear relationship, so is it just like, here's liberals, here's conservatives, or does something change on the extremes?
On the extremes. I would have to look at that. That's a great question. Yeah, that would be good to look into. Because similar to cross-sectionally, some of the links between the religion and intellectual humility were showing a similar pattern.
Yeah, a question for Ryan, specifically about the common ground for action. I'm intrigued by what you said about the steps that you take in this deliberative format in private versus public to provide participants with information, specifically through video as a background training. And what's interesting is that, at least the formats I've worked with in deliberative programs, is that the participants have the advantage of contributing to that information through this process of concern gathering, which allows people participating to give some initial framing and naming, at least in the Kettering approach. So I guess my question is, first of all, in the absence of that, what do you find? How important is that naming and framing and the concern gathering that needs to precede deliberation? The second question is, have you thought about kind of creating a hybrid where you can do some initial concern gathering from the participants and then turn that around and frame trade-offs, consequences, choices that might be associated with those concerns that you gathered?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, you hit on one of the kind of the weak spots of the CGA system. So the CGA system was designed such that it could be done in a relatively compressed time frame with a large number of people. And so what you miss out on is that kind of larger, you know, if you have a multi-day event, you have the ability to first have the participants go through a generative process. Now, that doesn't mean that the generative process is completely absent in the CGAs. In fact, one of the most interesting things that occurs in these CGAs is some of the participants start linking up issue areas in ways that you hadn't thought about, right? So I am against, you know, this action unless we combine it with, you know, this action as well. And in fact, we saw in the Okoye deliberations, in particular, some of the law enforcement aspects were highly contingent. You know, we wouldn't want to decrease, you know, enforcement unless it was either corresponding community groups that were able to step into that and help. So you're right, we do miss out on some of that generative. The way we try to get around this is that we put a lot of upfront effort into the generative design. So trying to make sure that we get large number of members from the community and from the various stakeholders to help us design what the actions are, what are the key things that have to be addressed, and everything like that. But that's not obviously perfect. This isn't a replacement for multi-day. The other thing in terms of making a system that is more explicitly generative, actually that's something that I have a lot of interest in, and in particular, as it relates to the first part of it, the storytelling part. But we haven't been able to get there yet, and I'm not sure if Kettering is interested in pushing that way.
Elizabeth, one of the things that you talked about that was so alarming was the notion that people who have a greater level of intellectual humility aren't as engaged as others, or less convictions. And this, it makes sense because in a polarized society, it's actually self-perpetuating because of that. Because people who are most extreme are the ones that keep talking, and people who have more nuance, more humility, would be falling away from that. It's difficult to dissent or to have this open-mindedness when there are these poles that have taken over the conversation. So I guess my question is, how much of that is about an internal disposition not to be engaged, and how much is it that we haven't made space for people to have a complex and intellectually humble discourse that would allow somebody who isn't sort of convicted without any humility to actually engage and feel like the space was, sometimes we talk about safe enough for engagement, or such that people could engage and then develop a greater conviction. I'm thinking about students in particular in that case, but just anyone in any discourse.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're pointing out there are multiple reasons why that could be the case, that finding. Just based on the data I have, I can't answer that question, but I think, I was thinking of it maybe in terms of motivation, right? Those who lack the intellectual humility are very motivated to be involved and make changes, versus those who are more intellectually humble maybe lack some of that motivation because of their attitude with regard to intellectual humility. But you're pointing out it could also be differences about those who being more intellectually humble when they enter that space of civic engagement, having different types of experiences, maybe then giving up, and that would be something about changing that space or the atmosphere that in which they could participate. Or it could be things about them, more other traits, for example, that associate with intellectual humility. I think all of those could be relevant factors and would be interesting to look into more. It's very relevant, I think.
Actually, yeah, that was, but I think this thread runs throughout, and this was kind of my question about motivation, right? And I think it touches on you, on the idea that the prophetic prophet provides a certain level of certainty that motivates us, or gives the motivation and the conviction to engage in very difficult processes. I think I agree with Paul that you've got to read it, letter a little differently than you have, but at the end he comes to this. It does become this moment of that I'm convinced and I'm going to do this, and I think the interactive effects that Ryan finds are very interesting, and that might be able to help answer this question. You might, I don't know if you had the religious humility stuff in the first study, because you might check the interaction effect that might get there. But this is not a new finding, I don't think. Diana Mutz's book on Hearing the Other Side found the exact same thing. People who are most open to other perspectives and perspective taking empathy are the least likely to want to participate in politics. And I don't know if there's an answer to it. I mean, we can create some safe spaces, but what Ryan's research shows is that even when we do that, right, people who don't like conflict aren't going to feel comfortable about it. And CGA tries to be a very safe space to do that. So the question I guess I have is the fundamental underlying problem that kind of runs through all of these is this motivational problem. People have to be very convinced that they're right to give the energy and time and to do politics, given all this. And yet, right, that creates the very problems of democracy that some of us might have concern about. And is there really any solution? So,
Small question.
maybe could you give that to us? I mean, any immediate reflections you have on I mean, I think you,
Yeah, so I just
Elizabeth
shared.
already just kind of shared, so maybe Ryan, given your findings and interactions, you can tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so, I mean, a few things that I think are relevant to this. Number one, I'm not sure when they're going to actually come out with the findings, but there actually is some more doubt about whether these conclusions replicate within her own data. There seems to actually be some issue with it that they perhaps were not as politically unmotivated as was presented in some of those earlier works. A second thing with this is that I think you're right to note that people who are really conflict avoidant are less likely to get involved. But I think it's important to note that when we look at what happens when they do get involved or when they do participate in these, they do still, it's not like they have a negative experience with it. And it's not like we were completely missing conflict avoidant people from these discussions. So I think one of the values to be added in trying to expand the scope of deliberation and to make it to where it is more convenient is that we can actually start to draw in some of these people who may not be willing to go to a rally or do some of the more costly kinds of deliberation, but might be willing to take an hour out of their day to participate in an online forum. It might not be completely their cup of tea, but at least we can perhaps get these voices into the political conversation in some way, and maybe in the process help their external efficacy or something like that, which we didn't find that interaction for the efficacy results. So, at the very least, we can be helpful on the margins.
I was just going to add that there's a difference between the sort of examples that I gave, and they have to do with whether groups are engaging in what we might think of as kind of like public witness versus sort of more private relationship building. And and that's I think a distinction that also comes through in the King letter, right? That sort of at a public level, this is a public witness that we're committed to, right? But that we can still have private sort of moment. We need to be humble in our interactions with others. We need to love our neighbor, right? Like those things are not mutually exclusive. And in the second example about homosexuality, and I get this from the Moon and Tobin research on those organizations in which people are rethinking questions about homosexuality, those are really driven by commitments to private relationships, and particularly intimate relationships, and preserving those relationships. And I think that in those spaces, you really can sort of see people who people are drawn to those spaces when they're in fact quite repelled from those public debates, because those are viewed as sort of toxic, whereas here we can have real conversations, we can respect one another. And so I do think that, to the extent that these kinds of forums come to be seen like those spaces, the kinds of spaces you guys are creating, I wonder if there's just like a fundamental difference in those kinds of spaces, and the same people can actually engage in them differently.
And one last thing, and an idiot for not looking at this sooner. So in who wants to deliberate and why, we actually looked at the conflict avoidance, and conflict avoidance was only weakly associated with actual interest in having discussions with members of Congress and things like that. So there is some optimism that even if they don't necessarily have the same outcomes out of it, that there is still interest among conflict avoidant people in entering the conversation.
Last two questions. Please back.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess this is a question for Ryan, also for our own group and anybody else in general. What do we do about this white man problem? And
maybe I'm not the person to ask.
but more seriously, I would like to know whether your group or anybody else is looking into what sort of initial advanced preparation we could do prior to deliberations or to dialogue in the classroom. How can we set up these white men for success? Because it would be horrible to have these practices in general that are working in many ways very well, and yet we are disenfranchising white men, and that's not a good trajectory that we want. So I would love to hear if any research is being done on prepping deliberations, prepping dialogue work.
And as you answer that, can you tell us did the participants know the gender and or ethnicity and race of the other participants?
So they knew gender, ethnicity, race, not so much. Gender is easily inferred by the first names, and people were put in by first name. I think that that's a tough one to answer in a lot of ways. I think that part of the way that this gets set up for success has to do with the other finding that we noticed, which was the effect of having female moderators, essentially having women in positions of authority, right? We didn't notice that it affected men in any way, but we saw that it did have a pretty substantial impact on how women evaluated the sessions. And I think that part of the kind of longer term way of trying to avoid having the reaction like what we see with the discussion participation is to have it to where white males have more experience with non-white and females being in positions of authority. Perhaps this is, optimistic of me, but I think that that exposure does change the kind of attitude and the expectation of how discussion should proceed.
Final question is from Alessandra.
It's just a quick question to Liz. Did you look at moods? Mood. Because the reason, I don't know where I get this, and Greg will correct me if I get it wrong, Greg, but I thought that there might be some relations between being more humble and feeling sadder. And if you feel a bit sad, you're less likely to engage.
I didn't.
Where do I get this idea from, Greg? It's not answering me. It's at the back.
He's not
Keep getting
responsible for
over
where
it.
you get it.
Anyway, sorry, I'll get back to it.
Yeah, the only thing that might relate there is with one of the sub-skills that I used with intellect and ego. Some of those items will cue into emotional responses to intellectual disagreement, like when someone disagrees with me, I feel small or I feel attacked, and so the small might be connecting to some kind of sadness, but that's the closest I can think of in terms of anything from what I said.
I just thought if it has an effect, if the overall mood of people who are more humble, it's sort of more subdued, more negative.
Well, that would be interesting to do a mood induction and then to assess intellectual humility and see if it changes.
Let's give our panelists a round.